New York in the 1920s was not the bright, touristy metropolis we know today. It was a concrete and steel beast that breathed smoke and desperation, especially after the financial collapse that plunged the nation into the Great Depression. The streets were filled with men looking for work, families crammed into cold apartments, and a widespread sense of uncertainty. In this daily survival scenario, danger took many forms, from gang violence to extreme hunger. But there was a much more insidious and difficult to detect threat, one that did not bear visible weapons or scream threats. A threat that walked slowly, with hunched shoulders and a kind smile on its face. It was the figure of an innocent old man, a gray shadow that blended perfectly with the pallor of an exhausted society. To understand the terror unleashed by Albert Fish, it is necessary to first comprehend the environment that allowed him to operate with such impunity for so long. The city was a maze of immigrants and transient workers where anonymity was the norm. No one paid attention to a fragile-looking old man who seemed like a kindly grandfather, incapable of harming a fly. This social invisibility was his deadliest weapon. At a time when forensic science was in its infancy and there were no centralized databases or DNA profiles, a predator with the appearance of a victim could move freely among the most vulnerable without raising suspicion. The story of this fear begins long before the name Grace Budd appeared in the headlines. It starts with rumors in the poorest neighborhoods, whispered stories about children disappearing without a trace, swallowed by the voracity of the city. One of the cases that cemented this atmosphere of terror, and which subsequent investigations directly linked to this gray shadow, was the disappearance of Billy Gaffney in 1927. Billy was a 4-year-old boy living in Brooklyn, a place where children often played in the hallways of buildings or on the sidewalks under the supposed watch of the community. On February 11th of that year, Billy was playing with a 3-year-old friend in the hallway of his building at number 23 West 15th Street. The tragedy occurred in minutes. In an instant the hallways were filled with childish laughter, and the next moment a sepulchral silence reigned. When Billy's mother went out to look for him, the boy was gone. She only found Billy's little friend who, with the innocence and confusion typical of his age, told a story that chilled the blood of the neighbors. The child said that the boogeyman had taken Billy. This mythical figure, used for generations to scare disobedient children, had suddenly taken on a physical and real form in the landing of an apartment building in Brooklyn. The description that could be obtained of the suspect at that time was vague but deeply unsettling. They spoke of an old, thin man with an unkempt gray mustache. A man who did not stand out, who did not draw attention. A gray man. The New York police, under immense pressure and with limited resources for the time, launched a massive search. They dredged the nearby waters of the river, questioned hundreds of known offenders, and searched attics and basements throughout the neighborhood. But there was no trace of Billy Gaffney. It was as if the earth had swallowed him, or as if this gray shadow had simply dissolved into the polluted fog of the city. This event marked a turning point in the collective psyche of New York parents. It was no longer enough to warn children about strangers with bad appearances or aggressive looks. Now, danger could come from someone who seemed like a neighbor, a grandfather, or a well-meaning Samaritan. The figure of the sexual predator and serial killer, as we understand it today in modern criminology, was not clearly defined in the popular mindset of the time. They spoke of perverts or crazies, but the idea of a calculating sadomasochist using his own physical fragility as bait was something that escaped the understanding of most detectives and citizens. The psychological profile of Albert Fish, which would be revealed in detail years later, helps explain how he could commit such atrocious acts without raising immediate suspicions. Fish was not an impulsive and disorganized criminal in the traditional sense, although his internal impulses were uncontrollable. His grooming method was patient, gentle, and meticulous. He presented a facade of normality and religious piety that disarmed any alert instinct in his adult victims. He quoted the Bible fervently, and spoke of redemption and punishment with a conviction that was often mistaken for sincere devotion. This mask of religiosity was fundamental to his camouflage. In a society that deeply respected faith, a man walking with a Bible under his arm was automatically considered trustworthy. It is important to note that this enters the realm of retrospective analysis, but modern experts suggest that Fish operated under a system of complex delusions where pain and pleasure, atonement and sin were inextricably intertwined. For him, the suffering of children was not just a source of sexual gratification, but an almost ritualistic act. This total disconnection from moral reality allowed him to maintain absolute calm while committing his crimes. A calm that helped him avoid detection. If he had shown nervousness, sweating, or guilt, perhaps someone would have noticed. But the gray shadow felt no guilt. It only felt a ravenous hunger that it justified through its own twisted interpretations of sacred texts. In the years following Billy Gaffney's disappearance, the city lived in constant tension. There were other incidents, other kidnapping attempts, and sightings of a strange old man lurking in parks and play areas. The police received scattered reports of a man offering candy or money to children, but whenever the patrols arrived, the man was gone. The lack of rapid communication between police precincts and the complete absence of surveillance technology allowed Fish to move from one neighborhood to another, and even from one jurisdiction to another, restarting his hunting cycle without anyone being able to connect the dots. The extreme poverty of the Great Depression also played a crucial and tragic role in this story. Families were desperate for any help, for any job opportunities or extra income. This made parents sometimes more willing to trust strangers promising work or assistance for their children. Fish, with his predatory intelligence, knew this and exploited it with calculating cruelty. He presented himself not only as an harmless old man, but as someone with certain resources. Someone who could offer a better future or a small paid job to a needy child. In a world where hunger was a daily reality, the promise of a job or a bit of food was an irresistible bait for both overwhelmed parents and innocent children. The crime scene in these initial cases was often non-existent because the crime started in public, in broad daylight, and with friendly conversation. There was no initial violence, no struggle or screams. The kidnapping occurred through psychological manipulation and deception. The child went willingly by hand with their captor, trusting the authority emanating from the old man's age. This greatly complicated police work, as witnesses, if there were any, did not report a kidnapping. They simply saw a grandfather calmly walking with his grandson. This dynamic turned New York into a perfect hunting ground for Fish, where he could patiently select his victims, observing and waiting for the exact moment when need or innocence lowered their guard. As the 1920s drew to a close and the 1930s began, the legend of the boogeyman in New York had solidified in urban culture. Although no one knew his real name, his address, or his exact face, the presence of this invisible threat changed the way children interacted with their environment. Street games became more cautious, and parents' glances toward strangers grew more wary and harsh. However, despite the latent fear, economic necessity continued to push families to seek opportunities outside their security circles. And it was precisely this fatal mix of hope and need that would lead the Budd family to open their doors to the gray shadow. The police department, overwhelmed by organized crime and the social unrest of the time, had filed missing children cases under the label of runaways or accidents. There was no unit dedicated to serial killers because the concept did not even exist formally. Detectives like William King, who would later play a crucial role in this story, felt the frustration of chasing a ghost. They knew that something dark was operating in the city, an evil that did not respond to the usual motives of money or revenge. But without physical evidence and without a clear pattern they could process with the tools of the time, they were bound. The stage was set. The predator had perfected his mask over the years, and the city was distracted enough by its own misery not to see the wolf's teeth beneath the sheep's skin. The disappearance of Billy Gaffney had been a terrible warning that society could not decipher in time. And while the police continued to search for cold leads and chase shadows in the night, Albert Fish continued walking the streets, free, invisible, and hungry. He was preparing for the act that would ultimately define his legacy of horror and shake the foundations of American society, revealing an uncomfortable truth, that the most terrible monsters sometimes have the kindest faces and walk among us in broad daylight. The seed of evil rarely germinates in a vacuum. It arises from a toxic combination of biology, environment, and trauma that intertwine silently until a perfect storm is created. In the case of the gray shadow that terrorized New York, that storm began to brew long before it set foot in the city, well before the Great Depression and decades before the name Grace Budd was uttered. The story of Hamilton Howard Fish, who would later adopt the name Albert, begins in Washington, D.C. in May of 1870, within a family where madness was not an exception, but a dark legacy coursing through the veins of nearly all its members. To comprehend the magnitude of Fish's mental disturbance, it is imperative to look at his family tree, a document that reads more like a psychiatric clinical history than a family record. His father, Randall Fish, was a stern and distant man who died when Albert was only 5 years old, leaving the family in a precarious situation. But the true weight of the genetic inheritance came from a lineage of relatives plagued with religious manias, hallucinations, and erratic behaviors. There were uncles who died confined in state asylums, brothers who suffered mental weakness diagnoses, and a mother who constantly struggled against her own visual and auditory demons. From his first breath, Albert Fish breathed an atmosphere where reality and delusion were indistinguishable. However, biology was only the first ingredient in this macabre cocktail. The catalyst that activated his darkest impulses came after his father's death when his mother, unable to support the family, placed him in St. John's Orphanage. This place, far from being a refuge, became the school where Fish would learn the lessons that would define his life: pain and punishment. In the orphanage system of the late 19th century, discipline was physical, brutal, and constant. Children were beaten for the slightest infractions, and it was there, amidst the screams and the sound of the straps, where the wiring in Fish's developing brain crossed irreversibly. The psychiatrists who analyzed him decades later, like the renowned Dr. Frederick Wortham, concluded that it was in this hostile environment where his deep masochism was born. Fish did not learn to fear pain as any other child would. He learned to desire it. For a lonely child, emotionally disconnected and lacking affection, intense pain became the only way to feel something real, the only validation of his own existence. Over time, this association became intrinsically sexual. Suffering, both his own and that of others, ceased to be a negative experience and became the supreme source of pleasure. This neurological and psychological short-circuiting is the fundamental key to understanding all that would come later. He did not kill out of hatred or out of anger or out of revenge. He killed because, in his twisted mind, pain was the highest form of ecstasy and spiritual communion. Upon leaving the orphanage and entering adulthood, Fish attempted to don the mask of normalcy. He married in 1998 and had 6 children, working various low-paying jobs as a painter and decorator. In the eyes of his neighbors and acquaintances, he was a quiet man, perhaps a little eccentric and reclusive, but harmless. However, behind the closed doors of his home and in the dark corners of his mind, the disturbance grew and mutated like a silent cancer. His wife, unable to cope with his strange behavior, eventually left him, taking the furniture and leaving him with the children. An event that, according to him, marked the beginning of his total decline, but the documented reality suggests that his aberrant practices had begun long before that domestic rupture. It is important to note that this enters the realm of psychiatric hypothesis based on physical evidence, but it is firmly believed that for years, Fish managed to contain his homicidal impulses by turning the violence upon himself. His body became a living map of his own madness. He practiced self-flagellation with nail brushes until he bled, burned his skin, and inserted sharp objects into his own flesh. The most chilling forensic finding that would confirm this came years later, during his capture and medical examination. X-rays of his pelvis revealed dozens of needles he himself had inserted into the perineal and scrotal area, which had remained there, migrating through his tissues for years. Enduring that level of chronic pain and constant infection without flinching demonstrates a physical tolerance and mental disconnection that made him almost inhuman. But masochism has a limit, and in the mind of a progressive predator, fantasy eventually demands more. It demands interaction, it demands control, it demands an external victim. It is not absolutely known when he crossed the line from hurting himself to hurting others, as many of his early crimes were lost in the lack of centralized records of the time. However, his own later confessions paint a horror picture that spans several states and decades. Fish claimed to have begun abducting and abusing children long before reaching old age, using his harmless appearance as his best camouflage. One of the first crimes attributed to him, although it was never proven in court due to the case's age and lack of bodies, supposedly occurred in Delaware in the early century. Fish recounted with chilling coldness how he attracted children with mental disabilities or from extremely poor and marginalized families. Children whom society had already forgotten before they vanished. This selection of victims was no accident. It demonstrated a calculated, predatory cunning. He knew that the police would not spend resources looking for a missing colored orphan or a fugitive with the same intensity as for a child from a wealthy white family. This instinctual understanding of the social system's flaws and prejudices was what allowed him to operate for so long in the shadows, invisible to justice. During the decade of the 1910s and the 20s, Fish traveled constantly. His itinerant work as a painter allowed him to move from city to city without raising suspicion. At each stop, his ritual repeated. He observed parks, vacant lots, and slums. He sought vulnerability, loneliness. In his confessions, he spoke of one particular incident where he tied up a child in an abandoned house and subjected him to torture for days before letting him go. This pattern of capturing, torturing, and sometimes releasing was part of his psychological game. He enjoyed the absolute power of deciding who lived and who died, who suffered and how much. There is an even darker facet of his early crimes that links him to his deep religious delusions. Fish began to believe that his acts were divine mandates or necessary forms of expiation. He voraciously read the Bible, finding in the Old Testament texts about sacrifices and punishments a perverse justification for his atrocities. He saw himself as an instrument of God, a modern Abraham tasked with purifying children through suffering. This mix of sexual sadism and religious fanaticism created an impenetrable barrier against guilt. For him, he was not committing horrible crimes, he was fulfilling a sacred mission. This made him infinitely more dangerous than an ordinary criminal who knows he is doing wrong and fears being caught. Fish did not fear human judgment because he believed he was fulfilling a higher law. As he aged, his physical appearance began to deteriorate, which paradoxically played in his favor in a macabre way. His hair turned gray, his shoulders hunched, and his face took on that expression of a kind old grandfather that would prove fatal for Grace Budd and so many others. But beneath that wrinkled skin, the strength of his obsession had not diminished. On the contrary, it had refined and concentrated. He was no longer the impulsive young man battling his demons. He was now an elderly man who had made peace with them, who had invited them to sit at his table, and who had embraced his role as the necessary monster in a fallen world. The historical context of the Crazy 20s, followed by the crash of the Great Depression, provided the ideal backdrop for his criminal escalation. While the country celebrated jazz and progress, and then mourned poverty and unemployment, Fish moved in the margins, invisible. In the years leading up to the Budd case, New York police and those from surrounding states had files filled with reports of missing children. Cold cases piling up on dusty desks without resolution. No one connected these scattered incidents. Nobody imagined that a single man could be responsible for so much geographically dispersed pain. The lack of communication between state police agencies was Fish's best ally, allowing him to leave a trail of pain without leaving a trace of evidence. It is crucial to understand that before Grace Budd crossed his path, Fish was already an accomplished killer and predator with decades of experience. He had perfected his methods of attraction to the point of turning them into a dark art. He had learned which phrases worked best with suspicious parents and what promises lit up the eyes of hungry children. He had learned to read body language, to identify need and desperation in a crowd. His origin was long left behind in time. The initial disturbance of the orphanage had become his way of life, his normality. When Albert Fish arrived at the Budd home in 1928, he was not a nervous beginner. He was a master of deception at the height of his criminal career. He brought with him the entire weight of his history, the trauma of the orphanage, the madness of his blood, the needles embedded in his flesh, and the memory of dozens of previous victims. All hidden behind a soft smile, a gray mustache, and a cheap suit. The Budd family had no chance against him, for they were not simply dealing with an evil man, but with the end result of 50 years of evolution of a perfect psychopathy. The stage was set for the fate of little Grace to be sealed, but to understand the specific horror of that Sunday in May, we must delve into the details of how he managed to deceive an entire family under their own roof, and how innocence confronted absolute evil without recognizing it, until it was too late. Tragedy often knocks on the door with the soft knuckles of opportunity. For the Budd family, residents at 406 West 15th Street in Manhattan, fate did not come with a scythe or a crash, but with an ad in the newspaper and a kind old man promising a better future. It was May 1928, a time when the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties still echoed in high society, yet barely touched the working-class families struggling day by day in the crowded neighborhoods of New York City. Edward Budd, the 18-year-old eldest son of the family, was a responsible young man determined to help with the household economy. In an attempt to find stable employment, he placed an ad in the New York World newspaper, offering to work. He did not know that those few lines printed in cheap ink would act as a beacon for the monster lurking in the shadows of the city. Sunday, May 27, 1928, began like any other spring day in the city, with the sun struggling to penetrate the smog and the noise of urban life starting to awaken. However, a few days earlier, a man had responded to Edward's ad. He introduced himself at the Budd apartment as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, Long Island. The appearance of this man was the very definition of harmlessness. He wore a worn but clean suit, had gray hair, a droopy mustache, and eyes that seemed to convey a weary kindness. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic, as he described his farm, the cows, the fresh air, and the need for a strong young man like Edward to help him with the chores on the field. For Edward's parents, Delia and Albert Budd, this man was an answer to their prayers. He not only offered a job for their son, but promised to take him out of the tainted environment of the city and bring him to the countryside, a place that in the popular imagination of the time represented health and morality. Frank Howard spoke of fair wages and a family atmosphere. He sat at their table, shared his meal, and listened to their stories. He was the perfect grandfather that everyone would have wished for. No one could suspect that behind that mask of friendly farmer lurked Albert Fish, the predator who had been hunting for decades and saw the Budd family not as people, but as pieces on a macabre chessboard. During that first visit, something changed in the predator's dynamic. Although he had initially gone for Edward, his eyes fell on the family's youngest daughter, Grace Budd. Grace was 10 years old, a lively girl with bright eyes and an easy smile, the joy of the household. At that moment, according to later analyses of his behavior, Fish's target changed instantly. Edward ceased to be the main prey and became a means to attain a much darker prize. Fish, with his manipulative intelligence, did not show any lascivious interest that would have alerted the parents. On the contrary, he exhibited the interest of a loving elder missing his own grandchildren. On Sunday the 27th, Fish returned to the Budd apartment to finalize the details of Edward's job. But he brought with him a different story. He said he had to go to a birthday party at his sister's house in nearby Westchester County, and that he could not take Edward to the farm until later. It was then that he cast the bait, with a naturalness that chills the blood to recall. He looked at Grace and suggested that the girl could accompany him to the party. He said there would be other children, cake, ice cream, and flowers. He painted an irresistible picture for a 10-year-old girl who spent her days among the asphalt and gray brick of Manhattan. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Fish knew that if he asked to take the girl alone, without a socially acceptable pretext, the parents would refuse. But by framing it as a children's party at his sister's house, a respectable woman according to his story, and having already established a trusting and grandfatherly relationship with the family, the request seemed not only reasonable, but generous. Delia and Albert Budd hesitated for a moment. She was their little girl, and handing her over to a man they had just met, no matter how kind he seemed, went against their natural protective instinct. But Fish gently insisted, promising to care for her as if she were his own blood, and assuring them he would bring her back early that very night so she could go to school the next day. Grace, excited at the prospect of a party, gifts, and sweets, begged to go. She put on her best dress, a white dress that her mother had carefully prepared, perhaps thinking of her future First Communion or Sunday church. That white dress would become a lasting symbol of betrayed innocence in this case. The image of Grace getting dressed, unaware of the fate that awaited her, is one of the most heartbreaking moments in this account. The parents, overwhelmed by the kind old man's suggestion and their daughter's enthusiasm, agreed. They gave Fish a little money for the train, though he insisted it was unnecessary, reinforcing his image as a benefactor. The departure from the apartment was a scene that would be repeated in the nightmares of the Budd family for the rest of their lives. Grace walked out hand in hand with Frank Howard, smiling and bidding farewell to her parents and brother Edward. They went down the building stairs and stepped out onto 15th Street. Neighbors saw them pass, an old man walking slowly and a girl skipping alongside him, confident and happy. There was no coercion, no fear. It was a kidnapping in broad daylight, executed without weapons and without visible violence, only with the power of lies and the vulnerability of human trust. The train ride to Westchester County must have been a strange experience for Grace. Moving away from the security of her neighborhood, watching as buildings gave way to greener, more open areas. Fish, according to his own later confession, maintained the facade during the journey. He spoke with her, pointed things out the window, keeping alive the illusion of the party. But in his mind, the countdown had begun. The sister and the party did not exist. The destination was not a house full of children and cakes, but an empty house known as Misteria Cottage, which Fish had previously scoped out. An isolated place, perfect for what his sick mind had been planning since the moment he saw Grace in the Budd kitchen. Meanwhile, in the 15th Street apartment, the afternoon wore on. At first, the family remained calm, imagining Grace having a wonderful time. But as the sun began to set and shadows lengthened along the streets of New York, a silent unease began to settle in Delia Budd's stomach. The agreed time for her return passed. The clock struck 6, 7, 8. Dinner was ready, but Grace's place at the table remained empty. Edward, feeling a growing guilt for being the link to this man, went downstairs to look, hoping to see the figure of the old man and girl turning the corner. But the street was empty of them, night fell completely over the city, and fear turned to panic. Albert Budd, the father, decided to go to the local police station. The reception he received there is a sad reflection of the era and the limited resources. The on-duty officers listened to his story with some skepticism. A kind old man, a birthday party, a possible delay in the train. They told him it was likely they had gotten delayed, that the girl was fine, that Frank Howard seemed like a respectable man, and that they would probably show up in the morning. There were no immediate alert protocols, no way to track cell phones or security cameras. The police did not see a crime in progress. They saw worried parents exaggerating a domestic situation. That night in the Budd home, no one slept. Every noise in the stairwell, every voice outside made their hearts leap. The mother was praying, the father was pacing back and forth, and Edward was going over and over every word he had exchanged with the man who called himself Frank Howard. They began to realize the gaps in his story. They did not know his exact address in Farmingdale. They did not know his sister's last name. They had nothing more than a name that could be false, and the image of a kindly face that now, in the darkness of uncertainty, was beginning to look more like a sinister mask. What the family did not know, and what the police would take too long to understand, is that Grace would never reach the farm in Long Island. At that very moment, while her parents waited in agony, Grace's fate had already been sealed in a lonely house in Westchester. The party had been the final lie. Grace's innocence had encountered the absolute depravity of a man who had turned pain into his religion. The disappearance of Grace Budd was not just the kidnapping of a girl. It was the beginning of one of the longest and most frustrating searches in New York's criminal history. It is important to note that this enters the realm of historical reconstruction, but it can be inferred that Grace's trust in adults was the weapon fish used against her. In the society of 1928, children were taught to obey and respect adults. The idea that an adult could want to harm them in such a horrific way was inconceivable to a child's mind. Fish exploited this unwritten social contract to its ultimate consequences. Grace did not scream or run because she did not know she was in danger until it was too late. On Monday morning, reality hit hard. Grace had not returned. Frank Howard had vanished. The police, now a bit more alert but still not fully grasping the magnitude of the horror, began taking formal notes. But the trail was cold before it even started. The name Frank Howard did not appear in the Farmingdale records. The description of the old man was generic. New York was a city of millions, and Grace Budd was just another child on an ever-growing list of missing persons. However, unlike other cases that faded into oblivion, Grace Budd's disappearance would leave a deep wound in the family, and in the detective who would eventually take the case as a personal crusade. The silence that followed that Sunday, May 27th, would last for years. A heavy silence, laden with unanswered questions and a pain that corroded the Budd family's souls. They did not know the monster was free, savoring his crime, and that one day, driven by his own madness and arrogance, he would break that silence in the most cruel imaginable way. But for now, only the weight remained, Grace's empty room and the white dress that never returned home. The gray shadow had fulfilled its promise of taking away pain and turning it into pleasure, leaving behind a wake of destruction that would take 6 years to be uncovered. Time is a silent executioner for the families of the missing. For the Budds, days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, weaving a shroud of uncertainty that slowly suffocated any hope. From that Sunday in May 1928 until November 1934, 6 long years passed. 6 years during which Grace's chair remained empty at the kitchen table. 6 years in which each birthday was an open wound and each Christmas a reminder of absence. The police, overwhelmed by crime in a New York battered by the Great Depression, had exhausted all logical leads. Frank Howard's name proved to be a ghost, a false identity that dissolved into the air as quickly as it had appeared. During this period of silence, the Budd family was crumbling internally under the weight of guilt and doubt. Edward, the older brother who had brought the monster home, bore a responsibility no young person should have to endure. He wondered again and again if there had been any sign he missed, any strange glimmer in the old mont's eyes, any inflection in his voice that should have alerted him. But memory is treacherous, and Frank Howard's face faded with time, becoming a shadow without defined features. The parents, Delia and Albert, aged prematurely. The lack of a body, of a grave to mourn, denied them the closure they needed to move on. They lived in that cruel limbo where the mind sometimes plays tricks, believing that Grace might be alive, perhaps held somewhere, perhaps with amnesia, perhaps happy in that imagined farm. The police investigation had entered what is technically known as a cold case. The files gathered dust, detectives were reassigned to fresher crimes, and the public's urgency faded. However, in the backdrop of this stagnation, there was a figure who refused to forget. Detective William King, from the Missing Persons Bureau, kept the Grace Budd file on his desk, not in storage. King felt that this case was different. It was not a simple runaway, nor a failed kidnapping for ransom. There was an intrinsic evil, a particular darkness in the way the old man had manipulated the entire family. King knew that the predator was still out there, and feared he would strike again, or worse, that he already was, with no one connecting the dots. So when hope seemed to have died completely and resignation settled in the Budd home, fate decided to break the silence in the most brutal and grotesque way imaginable. It was November 11th, 1934. The mail came like any other day, bringing bills and irrelevant news. But among the ordinary envelopes was one specifically addressed to Mrs. Delia Budd. It had no clear return address, and the handwriting was shaky, angular, characteristic of an old or sick hand. Upon opening the envelope, Delia found not a ransom note nor a letter of condolence. What she found was a missive that has gone down in the history of criminology as one of the most disturbing documents ever written by a human mind. The letter not only confirmed Grace's death, but detailed with clinical coldness and sadistic pride the girl's final moments and the ultimate fate of her remains. The content of the letter is so atrocious that a complete reading is often censored, but to understand Albert Fish's psychology, it is necessary to address the nature of what he wrote. Fish was not writing to ask for forgiveness. He was writing to relive the pleasure of his crime and to inflict new torture on the mother of his victim. He began by discussing an apparently disconnected topic, famine in China and the consumption of human flesh in times of desperation. With almost academic prose, he described how children's flesh was considered a delicacy in certain cultures under extreme conditions. This introduction served to set the stage, to justify the unjustifiable within his own twisted logic. Then the letter took a personal and devastating turn. The author confessed to being the man who took Grace. He chillingly described the journey to the empty house in Westchester County, that supposed birthday party. He recounted how Grace picked flowers in the garden, confident and happy, while he watched her from the window, planning the exact moment to attack. The description of Grace's death was direct and brutal, eliminating any hope the family might have harbored about a hidden life or a prolonged kidnapping. But the horror did not end with the murder. What followed in the text was the explicit confession of cannibalism. Fish detailed how he dismembered the little girl's body and how, over 9 days, he cooked and consumed parts of her flesh. He described the taste, the texture, and the satisfaction he felt in doing so. He wrote phrases that would pierce like daggers into a mother's heart, stating that her flesh was sweet and tender. There was no remorse in his words, only the boasting of a predator who felt untouchable, superior to the laws of men and God. The letter ended without a signature, but the evil that emanated from each stroke was a signature in itself. The impact of this letter on the Budd family was cataclysmic. Edward, upon reading the words that described his sister's fate, fell into a state of shock and fury. The confirmation that the kind man to whom he had entrusted Grace was a cannibalistic monster shattered whatever peace was left in him. Delia, the mother, collapsed. The pain of uncertainty was replaced by the horror of certainty. There were no more doubts. Grace would not return. And her end had been a nightmare that defied all comprehension. However, in his arrogance and desire to cause pain, Albert Fish made a fatal mistake. A mistake that Detective William King had been waiting for 6 years. Fish, believing himself smarter than the police, had used an envelope he had on hand. An apparently anonymous, dirty, and old envelope. But King, with his trained eye and obsession with detail, noticed something on the back flap of the envelope. There was an emblem, almost imperceptible, a small printed logo that the killer had not deemed important, or perhaps thought would go unnoticed. The emblem belonged to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. This tiny and fragile clue was the thread King needed to pull. It was not an address, nor a name, nor a clear fingerprint, but it was a tangible starting point in a sea of speculation. It indicated that the killer, or someone close to him, had worked as a chauffeur or had access to the stationery of that association. The analysis of the letter also revealed other forensic details that, while rudimentary by today's standards, were crucial at the time. The handwriting was analyzed by experts who determined that the writer was likely an older man, educated to some degree but with clear signs of mental disturbance. The paper used was cheap, common, impossible to trace by itself. But the envelope with that small blue logo became the centerpiece of the investigation. King clung to that letter like a lifeline. He knew that the killer felt secure, so secure that he dared to mock the family and the police after so much time. That excessive confidence is often the downfall of psychopaths. Fish had broken the silence not out of necessity but for pleasure, for the compulsive need to relive his acts and to extend the suffering of his victims beyond physical death. He did not know that by sending that letter, he was not only sending torture to the Budds, but was also sending his own death sentence. It is important to note that this enters the realm of criminal psychological analysis. The sending of the letter 6 years later suggests that Fish was reliving the crime in his mind, and that fantasy was no longer enough. He needed an external reaction. He needed to validate his power over the family once more. Experts suggest that in Fish's mind, the crime was not complete until the family knew the details, until they shared, in some perverse way, the experience of the desecration of grace. The arrival of the letter transformed the investigation. From being a cold and forgotten case, it became Detective King's #1 priority. The moral outrage provoked by the content of the missive among the few officers who read it served as fuel for a renewed and fierce manhunt. They were no longer searching for a kidnapper. They were looking for a monster who had crossed all taboos of humanity. The gray shadow had made the mistake of stepping into the light, even if only through ink and paper. And now the machinery of justice, slow but relentless, was beginning to turn in his direction. The tragic irony is that if Fish had maintained his silence, it is highly likely that the Grace Budd case would never have been resolved. It would have remained as just another disappearance in the archives of New York, an endless mystery. But his own pathology, his need to boast and to wound, betrayed him. The confession letter became the bridge between the perfect crime and the imminent capture. Now, Detective King had a clear goal: to find the members of that chauffeurs association, to track every batch of envelopes, and to find the man who wrote about cannibalism with the same naturalness that others write about the weather. The 6 years of silence had ended. The noise of truth, as horrible as it was, had burst onto the scene. And with it, the countdown to Albert Fish's end began. The Budd family was shattered, but now they had a weapon: the physical evidence of the killer's existence. The cat-and-mouse game was about to enter its final phase, a phase where the perseverance of a detective would face the cunning of a madman on the cold streets of a city, crying out for vengeance. In the annals of New York's criminal history, there are names of detectives that resonate for their technical acumen or brute strength, but the name of William King occupies a special place reserved for those who turn justice into a personal crusade. William King was not a young man when the cannibal's letter came into his hands. He was a seasoned veteran. A man who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer in the streets of a city that never slept and rarely forgave. However, the case of Grace Budd had lodged under his skin like an infected splinter, reminding him every day that absolute evil not only existed, but walked free, mocking the law and human decency. For King, capturing the gray shadow was no longer a matter of salary or professional duty. It was a moral necessity, an obsession that consumed his sleep hours and soured his morning coffee. The confession letter, with its trembling handwriting and nightmare content, was the fuel that rekindled the fire of an investigation that everyone else had written off as dead, while his colleagues read the text with revulsion and mentally filed it away as the work of an untraceable madman. King saw in that dirty envelope the only real opportunity they would ever have. The small emblem printed on the back flap, the initials of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, became his compass in a sea of darkness. King knew that the devil is in the details. And that detail, tiny and almost invisible to the untrained eye, was the fatal error that the killer's arrogance had gifted him. The investigation that followed was a testament to the old-school police patience and tenacity. There were no computers crossing data in milliseconds. No national fingerprint databases connected online. Everything had to be done on foot, knocking on doors, sifting through dusty files, and talking to people who often did not want to be bothered. King began his pilgrimage at the Chauffeurs Association headquarters. His goal was simple, yet titanic: to find out who had access to those specific envelopes. The association had hundreds of members, and the idea of interrogating each one of them seemed an impossible task for a single man. But King had no intention of giving up. In interviewing the association president and administrative staff, King discovered a crucial piece of information that drastically narrowed the search field. The envelopes with that specific emblem were not in general use for all members. They were part of a batch of stationery kept in the offices that curiously had disappeared some time ago. Someone had stolen a stack of envelopes and writing paper. King pressed this point, his bloodhound instinct alerting him that he was close to something important. Who had access to the stationery storage? Who came and went without raising suspicion? The answer pointed to a man who had briefly worked there as a janitor and occasional painter. An older, quiet man. who seemed harmless and had disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. In the association's records, this man was listed under the name Thomas. Although he sometimes went by other aliases, he was described as a strange type, sometimes talking to himself. Obsessed with religion, but hard-working. Most importantly for King was the physical description. Thin, elderly, with a gray mustache and hunched shoulders. The image of Frank Howard, the man who took Grace Budd 6 years ago, perfectly overlapped with the description of this anonymous janitor. King felt that electric jolt that runs down a detective's spine when he knows he has found his prey. But identifying the suspect was only half the battle. Finding him in the vastness of New York was the real challenge. The man had no fixed address registered with the association. He was a ghost, a vagabond moving from one rented room to another. Living on the margins of society, King began tracking down possible places where this man might have lived. He visited cheap boarding houses, soup kitchens, and shelters, showing the description and asking for an older man who worked as a painter and had a peculiar obsession with religious themes. The decisive lead came when King managed to trace an old, poorly filed job application that provided a previous address. The address led him to a boarding house on East 52nd Street. In a depressed area of Manhattan where people did not ask questions and anonymity was purchased for a few dollars a week, King arrived there with a tight heart. Fearing the trail had gone cold again, he interviewed the boarding house owner, a woman hardened by life but cooperative in the presence of police badge. When King described the suspect, the woman nodded. Yes, she knew the man. He called himself Albert Fish. He lived there, in a small, austere room. The confirmation of the real name was a moment of silent triumph for King. He was no longer chasing Frank Howard or a man named Thomas. He was chasing Albert Fish. The owner told him that Fish was a quiet tenant, although strange. He paid his rent on time, usually with the check from a small government pension he received monthly. However, the news that followed was a hard blow. Fish had moved out a few days ago. The room was empty. For a moment it seemed that the gray shadow had escaped Justice's fingers once more, mocking King again. But the owner added a detail that changed the course of history. She said that Fish, although he had left, had mentioned that he would return to pick up his mail, specifically expecting the check from his pension that arrived punctually every month. That check was his sustenance, his lifeline. And King knew that economic need would force the monster to return to his lair, even if just for a few minutes. It is important to note that this enters the realm of classic police strategy. King knew he could not issue a massive public search warrant because that would alert Fish and make him disappear forever. Fish was a chameleon. If he sensed danger, he would sink into another neighborhood with another name, and the hunt would have to start from scratch. The only option was a trap, a patient and silent waiting. King decided to stake out the boarding house, waiting for the exact moment when greed or need would bring the killer back to the door. King's obsession materialized in those long hours of surveillance. He became just another shadow in the boarding house lobby, watching the door, scrutinizing every face that came in and out. He involved the owner's son to help identify Fish if he appeared while he was not present. Although King hardly moved from his post, the tension was unbearable. Each time the door opened, King's hand instinctively moved closer to his service weapon. Concealed under his jacket, he mentally reviewed the details of the case: Grace Budd's face, the devastation of her family, the obscene words from the letter. All of that fueled his resolve. He was not going to let this man see another dawn free. During the wait, King reflected on the nature of the man he was seeking. What kind of human being could commit such atrocities and then continue to live a routine life, worrying about a few dollar pension check? The banality of evil was present before him. Fish was not a criminal genius hiding in a secret lair. He was a pathetic old man living in a rented room that smelled of damp and age. This disconnection between the monstrosity of his acts and the mediocrity of his daily existence was something that King found profoundly disturbing. On December 13, 1934, a month after the arrival of the letter, the trap was ready to close. The check had arrived. The owner had it stored away. King was close, invisible, waiting. He knew Fish would come. Psychopaths often feel invulnerable, protected by their own megalomania and years of impunity. Fish had evaded capture for so long that he probably believed he was untouchable, that God or fate were on his side. He did not know that a stubborn and weary man, armed with the just anger of a promise made to a shattered mother, was waiting for him at the end of the hallway. The atmosphere on 52nd Street was cold and gray, typical of a New York December. People passed hurriedly, wrapped against the wind, unaware of the drama about to unfold inside that red brick house. King checked his watch over and over again. Time seemed to stretch and distort. What if Fish had suspected something? What if he had decided to abandon the check and flee? Doubts assailed the detective, but he forced himself to stay calm. Patience had been his best weapon so far, and he was not going to lose it at the crucial moment. William King's obsession was not merely professional. It was a battle to restore a bit of balance in the universe. Fish's letter had tilted the scales toward chaos and absolute darkness. Capturing him would not bring Grace back or erase the pain of the buds. But at least it would assert that there are consequences. That even the monsters hiding behind the most perfect masks can be hunted. King was there to be the hand that executed that consequence. Finally, a figure appeared in the doorway. A thin old man, wearing a worn-down hat and a long coat that was too big for him. He moved with that characteristic slowness that King had memorized from the descriptions. He entered the boarding house with the confidence of someone entering his own home. He asked about his mail in a soft voice, the same voice that had deceived Grace's parents 6 years ago. King, from his hidden position, felt his heart pound against his ribs. It was him, there was no doubt. The gray shadow had materialized before his eyes. The moment of confrontation was seconds away. King knew he could not fail. There could be no mistakes, no struggles that would allow a flight, no accidental shots that would silence the monster before he could confess and face justice. It had to be a clean capture. He had to look him in the eye and see if he could find any trace of humanity in them. Detective William King's obsession was about to culminate in a meeting that would go down in history. The moment when the law finally laid its hands on the Brooklyn vampire. On December 13, 1934, the day dawned with the leaden sky characteristic of New York winters. A gray slab that seemed to crush the buildings and freeze spirits. On East 52nd Street, the city's hustle and bustle felt muffled. As if fate was holding its breath for what was about to happen, Detective William King had been waiting for hours in the boarding house. Camouflaged in the routine of the place. Turned into a statue of patience and nerves of steel. The air inside the building smelled of stale tobacco, cheap food, and dampness. The perfume of poverty and anonymity that Albert Fish had chosen as his protective cloak. For King, every minute that passed was an eternity in which the fear of Fish not showing up mixed with the eagerness to get his hands on him. The landlady of the boarding house, nervous but cooperative, held the envelope with the government pension check as if it were an explosive treasure. That small piece of paper was the bait. King knew that Fish's mind worked with a twisted and pragmatic logic. The killer could do without many things, but not the money that allowed him to maintain his independence and finance his little vices. Greed and need were the only human weaknesses that the detective could safely exploit. While waiting, King mentally reviewed the profile of the man he was facing. He did not expect a robust criminal, armed with machine guns like the gangsters of the time. He expected a ghost, a shadow slipping through the cracks of the system. Around 4 p.m, the main door of the boarding house opened. The pale light from the street briefly flooded the dark hallway, outlining the silhouette of a man. It was him. There was no doubt. Albert Fish entered slowly, dragging his feet slightly, with that hunched posture that made him seem harmless and vulnerable. He wore a worn felt hat and a long coat that had seen better days. At first glance, he was the living image of desolation and age. A grandfather forgotten by the world. But King knew how to look beyond. He saw the tension in his hands, the alert gaze scanning the surroundings before relaxing. He saw the predator hidden under the skin of a lamb. Fish approached the landlady and asked about his mail in a soft and polite voice. At that moment, King emerged from his hiding place. There were no dramatic screams or sirens. It was a quick and decisive move. The detective approached Fish, closing the distance before the elderly man could react. When King spoke his name, Fish's reaction was not that of an innocent man surprised, but that of a cornered animal, instinctively seeking to defend itself. His right hand shot toward the pocket of his coat with surprising speed for someone 64 years old. Anticipating violent resistance, King grabbed Fish's arm and twisted it with professional strength. There was a brief but intense struggle. Fish had a wiry strength unnatural, born from years of manual labor and a resistance to pain that bordered on superhuman. But King was younger, stronger, and driven by 6 years of accumulated obsession. He managed to immobilize the elderly man against the wall and reached into the pocket that Fish was trying to reach. What he pulled out confirmed that caution had been vital. A razor blade, sharp as a scalpel. If King had hesitated for a second, that encounter could have ended in a bloodbath in the boarding house lobby, with the handcuffs finally locked around Fish's wrists. The atmosphere changed. The adrenaline of the physical moment gave way to a strange calm. Fish stopped fighting instantly. His face, which seconds earlier showed a grimace of wild concentration, returned to a mask of serene indifference. He looked at King not with hatred, but with empty curiosity. The detective formally identified himself, mentioning the case of Grace Budd and the letter sent. He expected a denial, cries of innocence, or feigned confusion. Instead, he received a silence that was, in itself, a confession. Fish did not seem scared of the police. Rather, he seemed annoyed at being interrupted in his routine. The transport to the police station was a surreal trip. King sat next to the monster he had chased in his nightmares. Up close, Fish smelled old and dirty. But there was something more. An aura of disturbance emanating from him. During the ride, Fish began to talk. These were not the words of a man who feared the electric chair, but those of someone who felt strangely validated by the attention. When King directly asked him if he was the man who had taken Grace Budd, Fish did not hesitate. He nodded with alarming naturalness, as if he were admitting to having taken a newspaper that was not his. Upon arriving at police headquarters, Fish's presence caused an immediate stir. Officers and detectives gathered to see the vampire, expecting to find a beast with foam at the mouth. What they saw was a small, calm old man asking for a glass of water. This cognitive dissonance between the appearance of the detainee and the magnitude of his crimes bewildered many veterans. How could this little man be the author of the most atrocious letter they had ever read? King, however, was not fooled by the facade. He knew that behind those watery eyes and that trembling voice hid a mind that had broken all the taboos of humanity. The process of booking and fingerprinting revealed the first physical secrets of Albert Fish. When the officers patted him down and removed his clothes, they found a body that was a map of his own madness. It was not just the visible scars on his skin, but the strange hardness that could be felt beneath the surface in certain areas. Fish carried with him, embedded in his own flesh, the testimonies of his masochism. Although complete X-rays would be taken later, the simple touch revealed that this body had been subjected to self-imposed tortures for decades. Fish showed no shame or pain during the examination. On the contrary, he seemed proud of his endurance, seeing his battered body as a temple of sacrifice. The formal interrogation began in a small room, under the harsh light of a bare bulb. King sat across from him, accompanied by other high-ranking officers. It was not necessary to use pressure tactics, threats, or the classic good cop bad cop routine. Albert Fish wanted to talk. He had been holding his secrets for years, sharing them only with God and his victims. And now, before a captive audience, he felt the narcissistic need to expose his work. The capture had not been the end of his story, but the beginning of his grand finale, his chance to be recognized. Fish began recounting the events of May 28, 1928, with clock-like precision. He remembered every detail. Grace's white dress, the flowers she picked, the train ride, the lie about the birthday party. He corrected the detectives on dates and locations, insisting on the accuracy of his account. There was no remorse in his voice, not an ounce of empathy for the girl or her parents. He spoke of the kidnapping as one describes a successful work project. For King, listening to that monotonous voice recount the deception of the Budd family was a test of mental endurance. He wanted to leap across the table and silence the monster, but he knew he had to let him speak, that each word was another nail in his coffin. During this first interrogation, Fish also revealed the depth of his religious delusions. He did not see his acts as vulgar crimes, but as distorted biblical mandates. He cited passages from the Old Testament about the sacrifice of children, comparing himself to patriarchal figures who had to prove their faith through blood. This mezcla of sadism and religious fervor allowed him to sleep at night. In his mind, he was not a murderer. He was an instrument of a higher will, a misunderstood martyr carrying the sin of the world through the pain he inflicted and received. The news of the capture spread like wildfire through New York City. Journalists crowded the stairs of the police station. Flashes erupted, and headlines were prepared to scream the horror to the world. The Brooklyn Monster has fallen. The killer of Grace Budd captured. But inside the interrogation room, the outside world did not exist. Only King and Fish existed. The hunter and the prey, engaged in a macabre dance of questions and answers. Fish confessed that he had been living on 52nd Street under the name Albert Fish, his real name, because he no longer felt the need to hide. He believed that his fate was written, and that if he were caught, it was meant to be. He even asked, with a nearly childlike curiosity, if they would take him to the electric chair. The prospect of death did not seem to scare him. On the contrary, it seemed to fascinate him. He saw execution not as punishment, but as the ultimate experience of supreme pain, the ultimate climax of a life dedicated to suffering. For Detective King, the capture of Fish was the closure of a 6-year cycle, but also the beginning of a new burden. He now knew the complete truth. There were no longer assumptions. Grace had died a horrible death, and the man responsible was sitting across from him, cleaning his glasses with a dirty handkerchief. The satisfaction of duty fulfilled mixed with nausea. King knew he would have to call the Budd family. He would have to tell them they had the man, but that hopes of finding Grace alive were nil. That call would be one of the most difficult of his career. As the night wore on, Fish began to hint that Grace had not been his only victim. He spoke vaguely of other children, in other states. At other times, he dropped names in places like breadcrumbs, suggesting a trail of blood that extended far beyond New York. The detectives exchanged looks of horror. They realized that they had not simply captured a child's killer. They had opened the door to a crypt full of forgotten corpses. Capturing the elderly man from 52nd Street was not the end of the book, but merely the end of the first chapter of an encyclopedia of evil. Albert Fish spent his first night in a secure cell, constantly monitored to prevent him from committing suicide, even though he showed no intention of doing so. He slept deeply, like a man with a clear conscience. Outside, New York City breathed a little easier, knowing that the gray shadow was behind bars. But for William King, who stayed awake reviewing his notes and smoking cigarette after cigarette, the true nightmare had just begun. Now they had to hear the details. Now they had to document cannibalism, sadism, and madness. The capture had been clean, but what would come next would dirty the souls of all who had to hear it. When the doors of the interrogation room closed, isolating Albert Fish from the rest of the world, the atmosphere within those four walls changed drastically. What followed was not a standard police interrogation, where the truth is extracted with difficulty and resistance. It was instead a macabre monologue, a lecture on horror delivered by an old man who spoke of death and desecration with the same tranquility with which others speak of the weather or cooking recipes. The detectives present, seasoned men who had seen corpses in all their forms on the violent streets of New York, were not prepared for the level of depravity that was about to be verbalized. Fish's confession sought not only to admit legal guilt, it sought to relive the sensory pleasure of his crimes, savoring cada palabra como si fuera un bocado de un festín prohibido. The central point of his story was inevitably the final fate of little Grace Budd. Fish resumed the tale in the empty house of Westchester, Misteria Cottage. He described how he left the girl playing outside, picking flowers, a picture of pastoral innocence that violently contrasted with his dark intentions. He recounted how he called her inside, shutting the door behind her and sealing her fate. The mechanics of the murder were described without emotion, strangulation. Fish explained that he did not want her to suffer too much at first, not out of pity, but because he needed the body to be in specific conditions for what would come next. He claimed that Grace died a virgin, a detail he insisted upon with a strange Puritan obsession, arguing that this was vital for his own moral and religious justification. But murder was only the prelude. What left the court reporters with trembling hands and the detectives with queasy stomachs was the detailed description of the dismemberment and consumption process. Fish confessed that after killing the girl, he proceeded to dismember the body with tools he had brought prepared. He did not do it with the rage of a frenzied madman, but with the precision of a methodical butcher. He separated the flesh from the bones, wrapped selected parts in newspaper, and returned to New York with Grace's remains in his suitcase. It is hard to imagine a more grotesque scene than this old man traveling on a commuter train, surrounded by oblivious passengers, carrying the remains of the girl he had just murdered. Once in the solitude of his rented room, he began the cannibalism ritual that would last 9 days. Fish described his culinary methods with chilling domestic prose. He spoke of how he cooked the meat with carrots, onions, and strips of bacon to enhance flavor. He detailed the stews and roasts he prepared, and how he sat down to the table each night to consume his sacrament. What disturbed investigators most was not just the act itself, but the satisfaction Fish expressed when recalling it. He said that the meat of the girl was sweet and tender, the best he had ever tasted. He claimed he felt no disgust but a profound communion. For his delirious mind, by consuming Grace, she became part of him forever, a twisted form of love and total possession that escaped any conventional psychiatric logic. It is important to note that this delves into the realm of deep psychopathological analysis, but experts who studied Fish suggest that cannibalism was the ultimate expression of his desire for transcendence. By eating his victims, Fish believed he was absorbing their innocence and vitality, purifying them through his own corrupted body. This fusion of mysticism and atrocity allowed him to look police officers in the eyes and smile while recounting how he had consumed parts of a 10-year-old girl's body. He did not see a crime, he saw a sacred act. However, the confession was not limited to the Bud case. Fish, feeling the center of attention, opened the floodgates of his memory and began to speak of other horrors. He confessed to the murder of Billy Gaffney, the missing boy from 1927 we talked about at the beginning of the story. The details of this crime were even more brutal, if possible. Fish recounted how he took Billy and led him to a basement in Brooklyn. There, the torture was prolonged. Fish admitted to having used a homemade whip, a wooden paddle with embedded nails, to beat the boy. He described how he enjoyed the screams and the crying, seeing in the suffering of others a mirror of his own internal pain. In Billy's case, there was also mutilation, and Fish confessed to having thrown away the remains he did not consume into a filthy water canal, disposing of them as if they were trash. This confession solved a 7-year mystery, but brought a new wave of pain to the Gaffney family, who had maintained minimal hope all that time. Fish's coldness in speaking of Billy, describing him as a small, tough boy, demonstrated that for him, victims were interchangeable, mere objects designed to satisfy his impulses. He did not remember their personalities, only remembered their flesh and their screams. To corroborate his sadism and masochism, Fish did not only use words. He invited doctors and detectives to examine his own body as irrefutable proof of his madness. It was then that the famous X-rays were taken at Bellevue Hospital. The images revealed something that defied medical understanding. In the pelvic area of Albert Fish, there were at least 29 sewing needles deeply inserted in the flesh. Fish explained that he had inserted them himself over the years, pushing them under the skin to feel constant pain. Some of these needles had migrated, infecting tissue, but he never sought medical help. He lived with that sharp pain every second of his life, and he adored it. In addition to the needles, Fish showed his self-flagellation tools. He pulled out a wooden paddle studded with copper and leather nails, an instrument he called his punishment paddle. He explained how he would beat himself until he bled, sometimes while praying, sometimes while fantasizing about children. This revelation was crucial for psychiatrists to understand the nature of his mind. Fish did not distinguish between the pain inflicted on himself and the pain inflicted on others. It was all part of the same cycle of atonement and pleasure. Pain was his god, and he was its most devoted prophet. During the days that the interrogations lasted, Fish confessed to having abused over 100 children in various states over 20 years. Although many of these claims were impossible to verify due to the passage of time and lack of records, the precision with which he described certain places and modus operandi lent credibility to the extent of his monstrosity. He spoke of children in Staten Island, in the Bronx, in New Jersey. He talked about how he lured them with promises of seeing horses, of candy, or of simple jobs. He boasted of his ability to deceive parents, and how the police had never been near to catching him until he decided to send that letter himself. Fish's attitude towards his own crimes oscillated between indifference and pride. At one point, he described how he liked to see children die, how the light faded from their eyes. He said it was a moment of absolute power. However, immediately afterward, he could speak of religion and quote the Bible, arguing that God had ordered him to cleanse the world of those children. This dichotomy between the ruthless killer and the religious fanatic confused and terrified those who listened to him. There was no human remorse, no spark of conscience that even the hardest criminals tend to show in the end. In Fish, there was only a deep and black void. The impact of these confessions on the detectives in charge of the case was devastating. Men like William King, who thought they had seen it all, emerged from the interrogation room pale, needing fresh air and alcohol to cleanse their minds of the images that Fish had painted with words. The society of the time, which was just beginning to understand concepts like sexual psychopathy, was facing an evil with no name. Newspapers, while censoring the more graphic details of cannibalism and sexual perversions, conveyed enough to plunge New York into a state of collective shock. People wondered how such a being had been able to walk among them for so long without being detected. Fish also spoke of his family, of his children, whom he claimed to have never touched in that way. Although records suggested an environment of abuse and neglect at home, he tried to paint a picture of himself as a good father struggling against external demons, but the reality of his deeds contradicted any attempt at humanization. His children, now adults, would renounce him, horrified to discover that the strange old man who was their father was actually the most feared monster in the nation. As the pages of the signed confession accumulated, it became clear that the trial would not be about whether Fish did it or not. The evidence was overwhelming, and his own mouth was his worst accuser. The legal battle would focus on his sanity. Could a man who ate children and inserted needles into his groin be legally considered sane? Did he understand the difference between good and evil, or did he live in an alternate reality where those norms did not apply? Fish seemed anxious for the trial, not to defend himself, but to have a larger audience before which to expound his philosophy of pain. The police investigation phase concluded with a file that was a literal descent into hell. Fish had provided the maps, the names, and the methods. He had handed justice not only the symbolic body of the crime, but the complete anatomy of a broken mind. With the signed confessions and the catalogued physical evidence, the stage now moved to the Westchester County Courthouse, where a jury would have to look the gray shadow in the face and decide whether he deserved to live in an asylum or die in the electric chair. The story of the Brooklyn vampire was far from over. His final act would be a public spectacle where science, law, and religion would clash violently. The trial of the people against Albert Fish began in March 1935 in the Westchester County Courthouse in White Plains, New York. The atmosphere surrounding the building was unprecedented. Journalists from all over the country had gathered like vultures, eager to report the gruesome details of a case that mixed religion, cannibalism, and child abuse. The public, fascinated and horrified in equal measure, struggled to get a seat in the gallery. However, when the accused entered the courtroom, there was a murmur of disbelief. They did not see a roaring monster or a wild beast. They saw a frail 65-year-old man, with gray hair slicked back and an expression of senile distraction. He looked like the kind of man who feeds pigeons in the park, not someone who dismembers children. This visual dissonance was the first obstacle the prosecution had to overcome, convincing the jury that behind this facade of an innocuous grandfather lay the devil himself. Fish's defense, led by attorney James Dempsey, had a clear and unique strategy: insanity. They did not attempt to deny the facts. With the confession letters, the remains found, and the defendant's own admission, denying the crimes would have been absurd. Instead, Dempsey bet everything on proving that Albert Fish was legally insane, that his mind was so broken and warped that he could not distinguish between right and wrong. To this end, the defense brought a series of eminent psychiatrists to the stand, including Dr. Frederick Wortham, who would later write extensively about the case. Dr. Wortham's testimony was one of the most shocking moments of the trial. He described Fish not as a common criminal, but as a unique psychiatric specimen. He spoke of his religious delusions, how Fish believed that God spoke to him and ordered him to punish children to purify them. He explained the concept of coprophagia and extreme masochism that defined the accused's existence. But the crown jewel of the defense was not the words, but the images. The jury was shown X-rays of Fish's pelvis. In the dark room, the illuminated plates revealed dozens of needles embedded in his flesh, shining like little stars of self-inflicted pain. The jury gasped. It was irrefutable physical evidence that the man sitting in the defendant's chair was not functioning as a normal human being. Who in their right mind would live with needles stuck in their groin for pleasure? However, the prosecution, led by relentless District Attorney Elbert Gallagher, had a much more pragmatic and lethal argument. New York law at the time, based on the Manhattan rules, established that to be declared insane, the defendant had to be incapable of understanding the nature and quality of their actions, or not know that what they were doing was wrong. Gallagher brilliantly argued that, regardless of Fish's perversions and delusions, he knew perfectly well that his acts were illegal. Why else had he deceived Grace's parents with a false name? Why had he taken the girl to an isolated house in another county? Why had he hidden the remains and cleaned up the crime scene? The planning, deception, and concealment were evidence of a calculating mind, not a mind lost in madness. Fish knew that society condemned his acts, and that is why he committed them in secret. During the course of the trial, Albert Fish's behavior was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. He sat in his chair with absolute calm, sometimes appearing bored, sometimes amused. It was said that he filled his pockets with candy given to him by onlookers, and that he listened to accounts of his cannibalism with critical attention, as if he were assessing the accuracy of a biography. When the most graphic parts of his letter to Mrs. Budd were read, Fish did not lower his gaze in embarrassment. On the contrary, his eyes shone with an intensity that many described as inhuman. He enjoyed being the center of attention. He relished reliving the horror before a captive audience. For him, the trial was not punishment, but the culmination of his masterpiece. The confrontation between psychiatry and law was fierce. Doctors said he was insane. The law said he was evil. Gallagher painted Fish as a sadistic predator who used religion as an excuse, not a cause. He argued that allowing Fish to go to an asylum would be a mockery of justice and the memory of little Grace. The jury, composed of family men, had to weigh the scientific evidence of a sick mind against the moral evidence of an unforgivable act. The image of Grace's white dress and the details of her dismemberment weighed more than any clinical diagnosis. After 10 days of trial, the case was handed over to the jury. The deliberation was quick, lasting only an hour. When they returned to the courtroom, the verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge did not hesitate to impose the sentence. Albert Fish was to die in the electric chair. Fish's reaction to his death sentence has become part of the dark legend of criminology. He did not cry, plead, or faint. According to witnesses, his eyes lit up, and a twisted smile appeared on his lips. Later, he would declare that the thought of the electric chair fascinated him. He saw it as the supreme pain, the ultimate experience of masochism he had been seeking all his life. He said with a chilling coldness, "What joy to die in the electric chair. It will be the ultimate shiver, the only one I have not yet experienced." Fish was transferred to Sing Sing prison to await his execution in death row. During the months of waiting, he was a model prisoner. He read his Bible, ate heartily, and slept soundly. The guards and the prison chaplain were bewildered by his tranquility. There was no trace of remorse. Fish continued to insist that he had done God's will, and that his death would simply be a transition to a higher plane where he would be rewarded for his sacrifices. This delirious certainty protected him from fear until the very last second. On January 16, 1936, the final day arrived. Albert Fish, now 65, dressed carefully and walked to the death chamber without needing to be dragged. He entered the room where old Sparky, New York's infamous electric chair, awaited him. There were witnesses present, including doctors and journalists, who observed in silence. Fish sat in the chair as naturally as one sits on their porch at home. He even helped the executioner, Robert Elliott, place the electrodes on his leg, rolling up his pant leg to make the job easier. There is a persistent legend about Albert Fish's execution that deserves to be mentioned, even if it strays into the anecdotal. It is said that the needles Fish had embedded in his pelvis caused a short circuit during the first jolt, or interfered with the flow of electricity, requiring a more powerful second jolt to kill him. While official records indicate a standard execution with 2 jolts to ensure clinical death, the idea that his own body, modified by his madness, resisted dying adds a final layer of mystery to his figure. His last words, or lack thereof, are also a subject of debate. Some say he murmured something unintelligible about God, others say he simply smiled. What is certain is that when the switch was activated and 2,000 volts coursed through his body, the monster who had terrorized New York for decades ceased to exist. Smoke rose from the electrodes, and the smell of burnt flesh filled the room, an ironic end for a man who had made the consumption of human flesh his sacrament. The death of Albert Fish closed the legal case, but did not heal the wound in American society. The case exposed a vulnerability that no one wanted to admit, that evil does not always have the face of a monster, that it can hide behind the appearance of a kind old man, that madness can walk freely on our streets, and that our children are never completely safe. The Budd family obtained their legal justice, but no execution could return grace to them or erase the images that Fish's letter had etched in their minds. Fish's legacy is dark and complex. For forensic psychiatry, he became a fundamental study case on sexual psychopathy, masochism, and paranoid schizophrenia. His brain was extracted and analyzed after his death, although no obvious physical anomalies were found to explain his behavior, demonstrating that evil resides in the software of the mind, not necessarily in the hardware of the brain. Today, the story of the Brooklyn vampire remains one of the most unsettling in the true crime genre, not for the number of victims, which could never be confirmed precisely, but for the nature of the crimes and the personality of the killer. Albert Fish forces us to look into the abyss and recognize that sometimes the abyss looks back at us with the eyes of a kindly old man offering sweets. His life and death remind us that the border between civilization and barbarism is fragile, and that the true monsters are those who walk among us, invisible, gray, and patient. Thus concludes the chronicle of the gray shadow that lurked in New York. A story of lost innocence, of police obsession, and of evil so pure that it defies all rational understanding. May the memory of Grace Budd and all known and unknown victims serve as a beacon of warning in the darkness, reminding us that we must protect the vulnerable and never ever blindly trust appearances.
If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel, activate the little bell, and give it a like. This way, you will help more people discover the story behind every mystery.
And so we close the file on Albert Fish, the Brooklyn vampire. We have looked into the eyes of madness in its purest and oldest form on the gray streets of a depressed New York. But horror does not only inhabit poverty or filth. Sometimes the darkest darkness hides beneath the brightest lights. In our next meeting, we will leave behind the coldness of the East Coast to travel to the other side of the country. To the Golden Land. To the Dream Factory where thousands of young people arrive in search of fame, and where, sometimes, they only find a premature end. We will travel to Los Angeles, in the year 1947. Imagine walking through a vacant lot in Leimert Park on a January morning. The California sun begins to warm the asphalt. You see something among the grass. It looks like a broken mannequin, discarded, pale, and split into 2 pieces. You get closer and realize it is not plastic. It is Elizabeth Short. The case we will address next is the mother of all unsolved mysteries in the United States. We will talk about a young aspiring actress eternally known as the Black Dahlia. A crime that was not just a murder, but a macabre and surgical staging. A body drained of blood, cut with medical precision at the waist, and with a grotesque smile carved on its face from ear to ear. Who was Elizabeth really? Was she a victim of a deranged surgeon, an untouchable gangster, or the very shadows of Hollywood that devour its children? We will delve into an investigation filled with police corruption, false leads, unscrupulous journalists, and a list of suspects that includes the most powerful figures of the time. Get ready, because if Albert Fish showed you the face of evil in a lonely old man, the Black Dahlia will teach you that in the City of Angels, the devil wears formal attire. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the truth about shadows over Hollywood. Until next